All right, HTML. All right, so as you might well be familiar with, HTML or hypertext markup language is a language that allows us to describe what a page might look like. Right? It allows us to add content, lay it out, specify how its organization is, and typically provide some static content. Right? Separately from HTML, we have another language, which we'll see in a minute, which is CSS, that specifies the look and feel, right? How, what colors to use, what background, what fonts, and whatnot. It used to be that that HTML also was used for look and feel and styling and making it look pretty. Eventually, it became such a complex task on its own that a whole language was developed only for styling. Right? It was also a good practice to, instead of styling it using HTML, is to separate the two tasks. One is for content and laying it out, whereas a completely different set of skills for making it look pretty and how to have the look and feel differently. Okay, so here's a very simple page, a web page. Notice that there's a structure that all HTML documents have an opening and closing HTML tag that has two distinct sections: the head section and the body section. The head section is for providing some meta information, such as the title of the page that shows up either in the bar of the window or in a tab, and also things such as any other dependencies that this document might have with other documents. Right? So, for instance, you might have in your head, you might have links to CSS files or JavaScript, other dependencies that you might have. The body is where we put all the content that is consumable by humans. So in the head, you put things that are consumable by the browser. Right? The browser reads the document, looks at any other dependencies, and resolves those dependencies, whereas the body is for human consumption. Right? And then you have lots and lots of these elements or these tags that style the page or give it its meaning of what it's meant, what is the type of content that we're adding. So let's just go through a couple of really simple HTML elements. The headings for creating different size of headings, typically for introducing new sections in a document. Paragraphs for displaying long form content, for adding vertical spacing, which typically you wouldn't have. Then you have lists for listing all sorts of content. Then you have two particular types: the unordered list, which is just bullets, or you have the ordered list, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. So here's an example for courses, semesters, listing them. We're going to have using this theme throughout the semester of using universities, courses, students, faculty. That's the theme for the whole semester. Then you have tables that allow you to render a tabular content. Early on, HTML tables were misused to render content in columns. It turns out that like in magazines or newspapers, we see that content is typically rendered in columns because it makes it easier for folks to consume the content. And early on, the content developers would use tables for rendering columns, right? Because tables will allow you to very easily create columns. Well, that turns out to be a bad practice, right? That we have since abandoned, and certainly we wouldn't accept that today. So don't misuse tables for that purpose. Okay, there's other ways of doing that. We'll see how to do it properly. Tables are meant for displaying tabular data, right? Where a row presumably is some kind of record, right? Where the data falls on a particular column that has a particular data type, right? So all the values in a particular column are dates or emails or first names, so it has a particular schema. So for tabular data, so tables for tabular data, do not misuse tables for laying out content, right? So tables, we have that has three distinct sections. We have the head, we have the body, and the foot. We're not showing the foot here, but the head is for what you might expect. The title for the various fields of the records that follow, and we have a row TR for row, and then the table headings here for the headings, and then we have in the body. We have also many rows, one row per record, and you have the table data for the actual data that is being displayed. Right? Okay. Again, all very static. Next week we'll make it dynamic. Right? How to render this all dynamically. Then you have input fields that allow you to ask the user for data, and the most common one is the input field that allows you for users to enter textual one single line content. The default type of the input field is text. So here I'm being a little redundant. All right, it's not necessary to put a type when it's a text, but if it's an email or date or any other type, right, you need to specify the type. Okay, so here's text is the default. So it just renders a rectangular box where you can type a single line of text. You also can have an input fields with placeholders that gives you you can provide a dimmed example of what we're asking the user as a hint. So that's for placeholders. You can uniquely identify your fields with an ID, right? And these are meant to be unique within the page. Okay, and the idea would be that you can then reference them elsewhere, perhaps from JavaScript or from other places. In particular, you can reference it from a label. Right? So label, for instance, here we have an input field that has the ID first name field, and this label is referencing that ID. Right? And what this does is that it associates this label with this field. Okay? Typically, when you have a field and you click on it, it becomes active. Right? You put a cursor so you can type. If you associate the label with the field, clicking on the label also makes the field active, right? And that's a good practice, especially on small mobile screens, right? You want to increase the touchable area as much as possible, right? So that it makes it easier to not just click on the field, but also anywhere around. Right? So that's a good practice to make it provide a better experience. So yeah, so make use of these ideas to make things more accessible for users. We have other fields of type date, for instance, that introduce the fact that each field now has a widget alongside with it. So for instance, the date field provides a widget for selecting a date. These widgets are not standard. They might look differently from Chrome, from Firefox, and whatnot. Oftentimes, what folks do is that they abandon the native widget and use instead either a jQuery date widget instead, so that it looks the same across all browsers. Nevertheless, this allows you to use, for instance, in the mobile phones, to bring up the correct keyboard, right, for that particular input field. So if you're on an iPhone, it'll bring up the iPhone's date picker, or if you're on Android, it'll bring up the Android's date picker. Right? So if you use the correct type, right? So IDs, values allow you to, in all the fields, allow you to provide the default value of the input field. So in this case, you're providing the date value for input fields, or the text, or email. You can provide different values. You have the drop-downs implemented using the select, and the select has many different options that are displayed as a list of options when you click on the drop-down. One thing to note here is that you have in between the option elements, you have what is displayed for the human consumption. This is what the human sees. Faculty, student, admin, this is what they see. But the value of each one of the options typically is what would be a computer-friendly representation, right? Something that might be a token or some unique identifier that some program might make sense of, right? Maybe something that a server might parse and say, oh, it's an admin role and whatnot. Yes. So here you might be fairly verbose text representation for the human being to make sense of what they're selecting, right? But then you have a more high-level token that can be parsed and make sense of some program. So this is some unrestricted text. If you do not provide the value actually becomes the text in here becomes the actual value of the select field. Okay, so I would suggest you always provide a value. Right, this is actually some token that you can programmatically use. For radio buttons and checkboxes, notice what we've done here is that to use radio buttons or checkboxes, notice that we use type radio or type checkbox. The one thing to notice here is notice that we have embedded the input field. We've wrapped it inside of a label field. See that? What that does is that it allows you to increase again the area that is touchable with your finger or with your mouse. Okay, so that if you don't do that, you would actually have to click on the actual radio button. Right? But if you wrap it inside of a label, the whole text becomes clickable. So it's easier on the user to have a better experience that they don't have to peck at this. Right? They can click anywhere around the area. So that you do that by wrapping a label around the input field. Right? The whole thing becomes clickable. Okay, so the text after the input field. The other thing here to note is that these radio buttons, by default, they don't know anything about each other. Right? So they're not mutually exclusive. Typically, radio buttons, the behavior that we would expect is that they're mutually exclusive. Right? So if I click yes, I cannot also have no. Right? So the way that the browser would know that these are related to one another is that they would have the same name. Right? Here we don't have a name, but so for instance, you might have here name A, and just because I don't have enough space here. There we go. So now the browser knows that these two, since they have the same name, they know that they're mutually exclusive. Right? If I click on one, it'll unselect the other, and vice versa. Yes? Meaning that if this gets submitted to the server would see A is equal to no, or A is equal to yes. Right? That's what gets submitted to the server. On a checkbox, checkboxes are actually not mutually exclusive. Right? So if I have a name here, say B, and I have multiple checkboxes with the same name, it would mean that B could have multiple values, right? All the ones that are checked. So B would be a comma-separated list of the checkboxes that are selected, right? That's what would get submitted to the server if I have multiple checkboxes. So I could have multiple checkboxes with one name, another multiple checkboxes with another name. Right, and each one would be independent of each other. Okay. What else we have? Obviously we have buttons. Buttons allow the different types of buttons. One of the more common ones is the submit button. If it's inside of a form, it will actually submit a form. We won't be using forms. I mean, we'll be using forms, but we will not be using the default behavior of forms. Okay, actually, we won't even be using the default behavior of hyperlinks. The default behavior of hyperlinks is that if you click on a hyperlink, it actually navigates to a page. Okay, well, we'll do that for the first assignment only. After that, we will abandon that. Same thing for forms. The default behavior of a form is that if you click a submit button, it parses the form, right? It creates a submit string, and then it submits it to a server. We will abandon that default behavior. Instead, we'll be using JavaScript to manipulate the form and do the submission ourselves. If you don't want the default behavior of buttons, you can explicitly say that this is a button, not a submit button. Right? So do not submit anything. Instead, just handle it internally. Anchors allows you to navigate and replace the content of the current page with some other content. So it allows you to have a piece of text. If you click on it, it dumps the current content of the page and it replaces it with some other content. Okay, that's the default behavior, and that will do that for the first or second assignment, and then we'll abandon that. Instead, we will go and implement single-page applications, which is entirely different mechanism for navigation between pages. Okay, in a single-page application, you never actually leave the page, the first page that you load. Instead, you dynamically load content strategically. So the default behavior is that it navigates away, and that's that. And we'll do that for the first or second. All right, so let's actually use what we have so far to implement a couple of things. Let's go into our web app here. Let's create the beginnings of what we need to build for our homework. So let's see. We'll need so the index page, like the name suggests, index means that this is the default entry point for this directory. This directory happens to be the root. Okay, so basically this is the entry point of the entire website. Okay, notice that if we navigate there, which one was it? Notice that here we're accessing that index page right there, right? But if I leave out the index page, I'm still navigated to the content of that index page. Yes, and that's the default behavior of all browsers. Is that if you navigate to a directory and you don't specify a document in that directory, it will by default serve the index page, right? And the index page, like the name suggests, is an index, right, that shows the content, presumably, of the content of that directory, right? And since we've expanded the use of the index document for providing access to the rest of the application or of that directory or whatnot. All right, so this is the home page, right? This is the default entry point. So from here, presumably, we can say that this is the entry point of our whiteboard. All right, so this is our whiteboard. Notice that I didn't have to restart the server. I just edited the page, and it's already available immediately without restarting the server. If instead I updated instead a Java content or something that needs to be compiled, I would need to stop the server, recompile, and then restart. But anything that is static, or I should say anything that the server thinks is static, I don't need to recompile and rebuild. Okay. All right. So we have whiteboard. What else do we need here? We have maybe links to other pages. Let's create entry points for them as well. So we'll create here the login page. So we'll follow the naming convention. So this is login. We'll say template. We'll say that this is a client, and this is a HTML. Okay. I'm going to say yes. Remember, don't ask again. I want to add every single file to my Git repository. I say yes. Don't ask me again. So here's my login page. So this will be h1 login. Let's just create a couple of these. So this will be register.template.client.html. Notice that it's not creating any of the rest of the HTML document. So typically this would be like this. This is really what we should be writing, right? So head and this body and here h1. So this is sign up. And let's create a couple more. Maybe HTML will create it for me. So profile dot template dot client dot HTML. Okay, so it created it for me. So the title we'll say maybe profile, and in here we'll say h1 profile, and we'll create maybe one more. So this will be a course editor. Notice that I'm following the naming convention that if it's more than one word, I'll use a hyphen between the two. Then this will be template dot client dot HTML. If you follow a naming convention, the rest of the team becomes familiar with whatever naming convention you use. You increase the efficiency of the overall team, and makes it easier for onboarding new team members, right? Because you explain that it has a particular structure. Whatever structure you agree on as a team, stick to it, right? And so that the overall team, when they see a file, they know immediately, in their mental model of how the system is, how the application is structured. If everybody does whatever they want, it's just a mess. Okay. If you think of a new and better way of organizing it, let the team know, and maybe you can all agree on whatever direction you want to go. But just don't go doing whatever you want. All right. So this is course editor. So this is H1 course editor, and maybe one more. We'll do HTML. This will be admin user dot template dot client dot HTML, and this is user admin. All right, so we have a couple of pages, and let's create from the index some a navigation. Oops. Where we can list all these pages, maybe in a UL. We can create some line items here that we can navigate to these. So we can navigate to profile. So this could be profile. And we can create several line items for these. So we can have maybe profile. We can go to login. So this would be login. Register. This would be maybe course editor. And one more. So this is user admin. There we go. So if we refresh there, notice that we have links to all of these. And again, the default behavior is that if I click on one of these, it just navigates. Notice that the URL is replaced, right? And what the browser will do is it will destroy the original content and will replace it with this content, right? That's the default behavior. We will abandon this behavior a little later when we do single-page applications, okay? But that is the default, and that's the way we're going to implement the first assignment, or the first couple of assignments. We'll do this. All right, but then we'll introduce single-page applications. All right, so let's focus on implementing a couple of these, perhaps the login. So let's go into the login and use one of the input fields and whatnot for that. So let's create an input field for our username. So for our username, we might have a type text, which is the default. So I don't really have to provide that. Plus, what else? What do we need here? Maybe we'll have an ID, and we'll say that this is a username, and maybe provide a placeholder and say Alice, and maybe a default. Oh no, that's it. Okay, and then maybe have a label, and say that this is username, and it's for the label username. There we go. So if we go and navigate to login and refresh, we have our first input field. Okay, it looks pretty ugly, but we'll style it a little later. Just a couple notes. Notice that my input field is becoming fairly large, going from left to right as I add new attributes. These are called attributes, type, ID, and placeholder. Those are attributes. So it's best practice to make it easier for the user to read this. Okay, so please, put each one of these in its own line as if it were a programming line. In a programming language, right? Each line, each statement in its own line. It makes it easier to read for everybody else. So anything you can make easier for everyone else to read, the better, right? Same thing for this username. We'll make that a little easier to read. Okay. Notice that if I click on Alice, the text becomes the input field becomes active, or if I click on username, also becomes active because of the label. One becomes after the other. It references the other. Again, it makes it easier for small phones to increase the area. Another thing here is that typically we might want to put this in its own line, so down below. So we could do one thing. We can do BR. BR, as the name suggests, is a break, right? But that's a misuse of the BR elements. BR is used mostly for if you're breaking up something that is better read by humans by using breaks. Okay, so for instance, like an address, right? So first, street 1, street 2, then state and city and whatnot. You put that. That's a good use of BR, right? For human consumption, add breakpoints for users. Instead, a better use for adding vertical spacing is to use what is called div. Divs add vertical spacing, right? But typically, browsers will render from left to right, from top to bottom, unless told otherwise. Right. So, for instance, the H1, H2, H3, those are referred to as block elements. Right. Block elements will render their content and then add vertical spacing. Right. Render some some element, and then render some vertical spacing. Right. Inline elements, such as label and input fields, by default, they render from left to right up until there's no more space, and they'll wrap and then continue in the following line. So, for instance, if we remove this and we add a couple more, right, and we say here we have a password, and we have here password. This is for password. And the placeholder might be some gibberish. Okay, notice that these are all inline elements, right? They're rendering from left to right, and the browser ignores any of our nice spacing and tabbing and all that. This is only for developer consumption, right? It looks nice to us. Right, for our frontal cortex, right? We like to have everything tabbed and easy to read and whatnot. The browser couldn't care less, right? It throws away all that formatting, right, and just knows that these are all inline elements and there's no vertical spacing. Not until it runs out of space and then it starts wrapping. So that's the default behavior for all these elements. Okay, so elements are either inline elements or block elements, right? H1. H2, H3, H4, all those are inline block elements. So they render all the way to the left, and when they're done, they add a vertical space. Okay? If you just need a vertical space, you can just actually, for instance, we would like to maybe break this up a little bit. Okay, so now we're breaking it up. We're converting it. A div is a generic block element, right, for non-specific behavior other than adding the vertical spacing. That's it. Okay, it renders whatever's in its content and then adds the vertical spacing. Okay, oops. Also, please add nice tabbing and white spaces for the TAs and myself and for the teams to better read your content, right? So your content, your code should look beautiful. It should be a pleasure to read your code. Okay, right? This is our time to shine. If we need more spacing between these, we can add additional divs here. Okay, if we want to break it up that way. Okay, all right, excellent. If we need some button at the bottom, we can add a button. And say it would be sign in, or log in, or additional hyperlink that would allow us to navigate maybe to the register page where you can sign up. right, which allows you to navigate to sign up, and presumably there'll be links to go back and forth between these two pages. Okay? Everybody good? All right, I'll ask some. Oops. Stop it. All right, so let's move on to another page, like for instance, like the user admin. In the user admin, typically what we'd like to be able to do, perhaps, is allow users to, or system administrators to allow to create, manipulate, or handle users, right? Create new users, change somebody's password, remove a user, all your user administrator, right? So depending on who the audience is, if it's an end user, right? Typically for an end user, you'll be more markety, right? You look more prettier, and you'll typically they typically won't be power users, right? So typically you use many more pages to convey a piece of information, right? For instance, if you're checking out, you'll first ask for the billing information, then you'll ask for you'll show a shopping cart, then your billing, shipping. So you'll break it up into multiple pages, right? Even if there's going to be stored in one single table at the end, you break it up for human users, yes, for end user. But if you're an administrator, typically we don't. You'll be typically you'll be a power user, and you'll be willing to consume much more information visually, yes. So depending who your audience is, the user interface that you're building should reflect who your audience is. Yes. So for human user, for a user admin, it would be completely appropriate to use a table for conveying lots and lots of information, right? In lots of large amounts, right? The more, the better, perhaps. Yes. So we might have a T-head for providing the information for the headings for the user admin. So it might provide maybe a table row for the username. Let's make this a little smaller here. Username, maybe have let me copy this. Username, and then this might be first name. This might be last name. Maybe role. Okay, maybe in last one. Maybe for empty, maybe for an action. And for the body, you might have multiple rows displaying multiple users. So you might have T data for Alice, and then the first one is a username, so Alice. So Wonderland. First name might be Alice. Last name might be Wonderland. What is it? What else? Role. Role might be admin. And that's it, right? And the last one might be maybe a button that displays to either edit or delete. Okay, so let's see. If we go back and you look at the user admin, looks like this is a table, although it doesn't look very much like a table. I can assure you this is a table indeed. We can change here one of the attributes, border, and we can say that we want 1 pixel border all around. So it is indeed a table. Anyway, so this is a table. It looks very, very ugly. And we'll style a little later using Bootstrap. Let's just copy some of these users just to show you what it will look like. Yeah, so we have lots and lots of Alice's, each one with edit and deletes and whatnot. Perhaps one of them, the first row, perhaps could be used as a form for creating new users or editing existing users. So instead of having here, or maybe part of the head, as part of the head, the second row in the head could be TH could be input fields. So this could be maybe an input field that. So we can have multiple input fields here. Is that too many? 1, 2, 3. So maybe just 3. Maybe one of them could be instead, let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so these would be input fields where you can perhaps create a new user, first name, last name, or edit an existing user, right? Presumably if you click on edit, right, it would copy this record on this form so you can edit their role, their last name, their first name, their username. The role could be, instead of an input field, could be maybe a select, where you can have select here. Maybe different options here. So option, and the value could be admin. So admin, administrator, trator. This could be faculty, and maybe one more for the student. So this is student. So student. So you have a drop down over here, and perhaps you would have maybe a button at the end, one last th here, with a couple buttons, one for create and one for update. Update. Right. That this would allow you to either, if you edit one record, it maybe copies it here. You can change a couple of things, and you can update that particular user. Or create a brand new user and click on create, and then it adds it to the row down below. Right? You can add maybe search, all sorts of filters and things like that. But this gets you started with the user admin, and presumably only administrators should be able to access this. Right? So this page would be perhaps behind a particular role. It's going to access this only. Right? So that gets us started with HTML. Let's style this so that it looks a little prettier, a little bit more useful.